By the early years of World War II, the United States Navy was powerful but not comfortable. On paper, it had battleships, carriers, and proven weapons. In reality, many officers knew something was wrong. American ships were well-built, crews were disciplined, but when it came to certain naval weapons, the Navy was fighting tomorrow's war with yesterday's thinking. Reports from the Pacific were troubling. Enemy vessels were surviving hits that should have destroyed them. Submarines slipped through defenses. Attacks that should have been decisive turned into drawn-out engagements. Quietly, engineers and junior officers began to question the effectiveness of the Navy's standard weapons. They ran simulations. They compared data, and the results were unsettling. One experimental system, still classified at the time, showed results that were impossible to ignore. In controlled tests, it demonstrated destructive power far beyond anything currently in service. By some measurements, it was more than 10 times as lethal. In theory, it could end engagements faster, reduce losses, and fundamentally change naval warfare. But admitting this created a problem no one wanted to face. If the weapon worked as advertised, it meant that existing doctrine was flawed. It meant training manuals were outdated. It meant that decades of naval strategy carefully built around accepted limits might be wrong. For senior leadership, that was not just a technical issue. It was a threat to authority, tradition, and control. So the discussion stayed behind closed doors. Official reports softened the language. Test results were labeled impractical or situational. The Navy did not deny the weapon's power, but it questioned whether such power was necessary. In wartime, necessity is supposed to be obvious. Yet pride, caution, and fear of radical change slowed the process. The Navy continued fighting with weapons it trusted, even as evidence mounted that something far deadlier existed. The problem wasn't that the weapon didn't work. The problem was that accepting it meant admitting the Navy had been wrong. And for an institution built on confidence and command, that was a step too far, at least for now. When the test results were finally compiled, even the most experienced naval officers were forced to pause. The numbers were not just impressive, they were disturbing. This weapon did not merely outperform existing systems. It shattered every accepted limit of naval lethality. In repeated trials, it delivered destruction at a scale the Navy had never intended to unleash from a single platform. Engineers spoke in careful language, but their meaning was clear. Compared to standard equipment in service, this new weapon multiplied killing power many times over. In one assessment, its effective impact exceeded current weapons by more than an order of magnitude. Targets that once required coordinated strikes were eliminated in moments. Defensive measures designed to withstand conventional attacks simply failed. For commanders raised on balance and control, this was deeply uncomfortable. Naval warfare had always been about managing force, applying enough violence to win without losing command of the battle. But this weapon did not offer control. It offered overwhelming finality. Officers worried that once deployed, it could not be used selectively. One mistake, one misjudgment, and the consequences would be irreversible. There were also political concerns. If such a weapon were fielded, how would allies react? How would enemies respond once its existence became known? Some feared it would provoke escalation rather than deterrence. Others warned that if captured or copied, it could erase America's technological advantage overnight. Quiet debates filled conference rooms. Advocates argued that refusing to use the weapon meant prolonging the war and sacrificing lives unnecessarily. Critics countered that its sheer power threatened naval doctrine itself. Fleets were designed around coordinated action, carriers, escorts, screens, and timing. This weapon made much of that thinking obsolete. In the end, the Navy did not reject the weapon because it failed. It rejected it because it succeeded too well. It forced leaders to confront a terrifying possibility: that victory could come so fast, and with such overwhelming force, that the rules of war they understood would no longer apply. And that was a future the Navy was not yet ready to accept. For decades, the American Navy had been built on doctrine, carefully tested ideas about how wars at sea were supposed to be fought. Ships worked in formations. Weapons were layered, controlled, and predictable. Every action had a place in a system designed to manage chaos, not unleash it. The new weapon challenged all of that. Its destructive potential did not fit neatly into existing plans. Naval doctrine assumed escalation, warning shots, suppression, follow-up strikes. This weapon skipped every step. Once fired, there was no adjustment, no second chance, no recall. Destruction was immediate and absolute. Senior officers worried less about whether it worked and more about what it would do to the fleet's identity. If one weapon could decide an entire engagement in minutes, what happened to coordination? To command judgment? To the role of experienced officers trained to maneuver, outthink, and outlast the enemy? The Navy had learned painful lessons in earlier wars. Uncontrolled power invited disaster. Battles were won not by raw force alone, but by timing, discipline, and restraint. This weapon threatened to replace decision-making with inevitability. There were also ethical shadows, though few spoke of them openly. Naval tradition held that force should be proportional. Sink the enemy, yes, but leave room for surrender, retreat, or survival. This weapon left no such space. It did not dominate the battlefield. It erased it. Reports circulated quietly. Some officers praised its efficiency. Others warned it would destabilize everything the Navy relied upon. A fleet commander's greatest fear was not defeat. It was losing control. And this weapon made control questionable the moment it was unleashed. In the end, doctrine prevailed over destruction. The Navy chose weapons that fit its philosophy, even if they were less lethal. It chose systems that allowed human judgment to remain central. Victory, they believed, must be commanded, not detonated. Only later would history ask the uncomfortable question: how many lives were saved or lost because the Navy chose restraint over absolute power? By the time the final evaluations were complete, the answer was already clear, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. The weapon worked. It exceeded every expectation placed upon it. And that, paradoxically, was exactly the problem. In conference rooms far from the test ranges, admirals and engineers reviewed the data in silence. Charts showed destructive output far beyond existing systems. Simulations demonstrated outcomes that ended engagements almost before they began. From a technical standpoint, there was nothing left to prove. What remained was judgment. The Navy was not rejecting a failure. It was turning away from a success it did not know how to control. Accepting the weapon would have forced a rewrite of naval doctrine, training, and command authority. Entire fleets would need to be redesigned around its presence. More dangerously, decision-making would shift from experienced commanders to whoever controlled the firing switch. There were strategic concerns as well. If this weapon entered service, others would follow. Allies would demand access. Rivals would rush to copy it. The Navy understood escalation better than anyone, because it had spent decades trying to prevent it. A single breakthrough could destabilize the balance the fleet relied upon to survive long wars. So the decision was made quietly. No press release. No ceremony. The files were classified, the prototypes dismantled or stored away, the project reduced to a footnote buried in technical archives. Officially, the Navy had no requirement for such a system. Unofficially, many involved never forgot what they had seen. Walking away was not an admission of fear, but an act of restraint. The Navy chose weapons it could integrate, control, and justify, not the one that promised dominance at the cost of stability. History would later celebrate the weapons that were used. This one would be remembered only by those who understood what it meant to say no. And sometimes, in war, the most powerful decision is not to fire, but to walk away. For months, the weapon had existed only on paper and in whispered arguments behind closed doors. Critics dismissed it as impractical, unstable, and unnecessary. Some called it an engineer's fantasy. Others warned it would never survive real combat. On paper, the objections sounded reasonable. On the battlefield, they collapsed. The first real test did not come during a demonstration or a controlled trial. It came under pressure: mud, smoke, confusion, and enemy fire. The kind of conditions that exposed every weakness a design tried to hide. When the weapon was finally deployed, expectations were low. Even its supporters braced for disappointment. Instead, it delivered results no one could ignore. Against targets that had resisted standard systems, it struck with shocking efficiency. Engagement times dropped dramatically. Units reported fewer follow-up strikes were needed. In after-action reports, officers struggled to describe what they had witnessed without sounding exaggerated. The numbers told the story better than words ever could. Enemy reactions were even more revealing. Prisoners questioned afterward described the weapon as overwhelming, sudden, and impossible to counter once it was engaged. What had been dismissed as unreliable now forced immediate tactical changes on the opposing side. Routes were altered, positions abandoned, entire plans rewritten in response to its presence. The most uncomfortable realization came not from the battlefield, but from headquarters. The weapon had worked exactly as its designers claimed. Every warning about its destructive potential proved accurate. The problem was no longer whether it functioned, but whether it fit within the war the Navy believed it was fighting. Success created a dilemma. The weapon did not fail, it disrupted. It threatened to make existing doctrines obsolete and exposed how much faith had been placed in tradition rather than outcome. For some, that was progress. For others, it was a dangerous precedent. In the end, the weapon proved something far more important than its lethality. It proved that assumptions, no matter how confident, can be shattered by reality. The battlefield had spoken clearly. Whether anyone was ready to listen was another matter entirely.